All right, so first of all, this section is on learning and memory, and I just want to bring a few things up on this before we get into it. Well, actually, let's define it first. Let's do that. Okay, in psychology, when we talk about learning, we're not necessarily talking about the stuff we do here in the classroom. When we talk about learning, we're talking about a change in behavior due to some stimuli that is in the environment, okay? Now, when we talk about memory, when we get into the section on memory, that's more of what we're doing here in this class when we study this in psychology. It's about knowledge, remembering, making connections between different topics and ideas. So I just want to bring that about so that you kind of know the difference when we're talking about learning and memory. One is behavior, one is knowledge, and that's a good way to bring it about. So we're going to spend some time talking about some of these individuals within psychology that really kind of brought about the scientific study. But I do want to emphasize that I'm limiting the conversation to the history of Western psychology so that we understand where some of these terms we get into a little bit later come from and whatnot. But human beings have been interested in memory and learning for a good at least 10,000 years, going back, way back when we started domesticating animals, domesticating especially, for example, dogs, going through husbandry and changing genetics and behaviors of certain animals. And so we've been interested in behavior for 10,000 years. When we look at memory, for example, we can go back, clear back to about 4,500 BC, where we see treatises on memory and memory tasks, and Aristotle, Plato, all of them wrote huge treatises on the importance of memory. And it kind of makes sense about this rich history, and we'll actually look at it when we get to the memory section, because for most of human existence, we haven't had our smartphones or our computers or our cameras. Even when it comes down to writing materials such as pens and pencils and paper, for a mass transmission of information, it's relatively recent. And so an importance on memory was huge for many societies. We can see it throughout here in the indigenous tribes throughout the Americas and even into Australia's, where that have been studied. I'm not limiting these, but that have been studied where transmission of knowledge has been a key aspect of verbal transmission of knowledge has been a key aspect of maintaining culture and the way of living and all of those kinds of things. And that placed a big toll on memory. And so my point being is I don't want you to think that we're limiting this understanding of learning and memory and knowledge and behavior to these certain people, okay? We're only talking about them because they're kind of the quote unquote scientific individuals who research them, again, from that Western perspective. So I just wanted to put that out there. Now, we should start, before we get into this conversation, we need to talk first about a camp of psychology that we briefly went over at the beginning of the class of what was known as behaviorism. Around 1920s, 1930s, here especially in the United States, there was a group of psychologists who were really kind of annoyed by the fact that it seemed like psychology was going back to being more philosophical than scientific. We're in the age of Sigmund Freud's theory, which is sounds very more philosophical, unmeasurable. We're looking at different other types of theories that are just seem kind of meta theories or meta theories, if you've heard of that, that's something that's beyond a measure. And they were like, well, we're not a science anymore, was their argument. And so what they wanted to do is bring psychology in line with the natural sciences. And what do we do in the natural science? We measure those things that are observable and measurable. And what is observable and measurable in the human condition or in any species condition is the stimuli in the environment. Let me see if I have this, my Stewie thing. The only thing that we can observe and measure, especially at this time, is stimuli in the environment, what's presented to the organism and their behavioral response, okay? And the behaviorists, which started with John B. Watson, which we'll get here in a minute, they wrote what's called the Behaviorist Manifesto, which says, for psychology to be considered a serious and serious science, I should say, that next to natural science, physics, and all those sciences, we should only do what those sciences do and measure what is observable, and anything in between, you see Stewie right here, anything in between, thought, memory, ideas, beliefs, attitudes are irrelevant. They're not something within the scope of psychology. And so here in the United States specifically, for about 60 years in the 20th century, the United States became very behaviorist oriented. And a lot of what we know about behavior comes from this behaviorist movement, as we will see here in a few minutes. But I do want to just say this, while this has helped us understand the behavior of rats and mice and pigeons, there's a reason why behaviorism is going to die in the end, which we're going to get to, because human behavior is much more diverse than just saying, hey, if you get this, you'll get a candy, and that makes it so you'll do it again. I don't think how many of us peck on a lever for food anymore, and those types of things. But I just wanted to give the context of when we're talking about learning and changes in behavior, where a lot of the information came from. So going back to here, what we're going to be looking at is psychology should only study what's observable, and observed animal behavior translates to human behavior. So again, for about 60 years here in the United States, we didn't really do direct studies on human beings within the mainstream of psychology. We did studies with pigeons and rats and mice and the like. Now, there are going to be some sub areas of psychology that are going to kind of save us. Like for social psychology, they studied, the Milgram study, the Stanford prison studies, studies of attitude, studies of in-group, out-group, and that's going to kind of keep the mind part of this into psychology, and then we'll see something called the cognitive revolution. But I just want to point this out and kind of emphasize this. When we're talking about learning in this context, we're only talking about what's observable. And this is important when we get to things like conditioning and stuff, that, and I'll bring up a point that you can't, for example, condition an emotion. So you can't reward yourself for having a positive emotion and assume you'll have a positive emotion in the future just because you rewarded it the first time. That's not how this works. It has to be an observable event, okay? So just wanted to bring those issues up as we talk about these different learning techniques. So there are some predecessors to what we would call behaviorism that kind of were studying different things at the time. The first one was Thorndike, and I thought it was interesting of trying to teach an animal any type of behavior. I could never figure out why he chose cats. I don't know if any of you have tried to train very many cats, but it's not a fun event. So when I picture him doing these experiments, I picture him running around and trying to catch the cat first to put him into a what he would call escape box. Just didn't make much sense of that. Yes, herding cats, Deborah, that's a good expression to explain this. But one thing that Thorndike did note about cats, and probably why he chose them, is that they are quite the problem solvers. When I first got my first kitty, my wife had him forever, but when I got my first kitty, it took him like 2 weeks to figure out how to open the doggy door. Even if it had the closure on it, he figured that out within 2 weeks. So one thing that probably the reason Thorndike did this is he knew that cats were kind of these curious kind of problem solvers, okay? So what he did is he put cats in this box that you can see here, and then he would put their food kind of outside, okay? And then he would put different contraptions for the cat in order for the cat to escape and get to the food. So in this case, he had this little ramp thing, and if the kitty kind of pulled on this string, it would let the door open and the kitty could go get their food. And what he wanted to know is, given if there's different levers, if there's different types of things, how many times does it take a kitty to understand what it is they need to do, even if this was something, a button you needed to push, something you needed to pull down, something maybe he needed to swat. How many times does it take him, even though it takes a different behavior, to kind of figure it out, okay? And this is where he kind of came up with this this graph here is if in trials 1 through 5, he noted that it took the kitty 240 attempts to escape. But then by about trial 20 to about 30, it took anywhere from about 10 to 60, or well, less than 60, no more than 10. So he denoted that this is a case of learning. Okay. Now, so that's interesting that we learn over time. It's probably not surprising, but this is the first time we get what's called a learning curve, which is going to be denoted throughout that with excessive trials, attempts in order to do something become less and less and less. And that seems like it's no duh, but we'll see it gets a little bit more complicated as we move along. But the thing that Thorndike probably contributed the most to this idea of behavioral psychology is he wrote a book called The Intelligence of Animal, or Intelligent Animal Intelligence, that's the name of it, where he argued, and he did quite convincingly, saying that what he observed in cats can be observed in any species, including human beings, okay? And so what he was arguing is a reverse of anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism is when we put human qualities into animals. What he argued is we could put animal qualities, learning, into human beings, okay? And so his real contribution is this idea that we can study animals and learn something about humans, okay? So that's kind of the starting point of why behaviorists tended to use animals versus humans to kind of gauge these different measurements, okay? Now, this is more of a memory task, but Ebbinghaus was an individual who was one of the first to kind of seriously study memory. That's the word I'm looking for. All right. And what Ebbinghaus did, though, in order to study learning, is he came up with a list of nonsense words, words that have no meaning whatsoever, no matter what language, whatever. It's words that no one really knew, or because they had no meaning, of course. And so, using this novel approach, he felt he could then measure the length of memory. Okay. And so on day one, this is the percent that the person could remember. So we give a list of 10 to 20 words. And he would say, okay, how many words do you remember? And then, of course, you probably guessed that if he did this on day 2, 1 hour to 20 minutes, we're down to about 50%. Day 2, we're down to 40. And by day 7, we probably only remember about 10% of the words that were learned by 7 days. So, and this is of course without repetition or anything or any of the learning techniques. Okay. Now, again, the reason this is important is if we go back here, here's our learning task curve. Here's our memory curve. Okay. And so, okay, so Ebbinghouse's contribution we'll get to more in the memory section. But there, and I'll say this, so the nonsense word thing, we're gonna test your short-term memory using either numbers or nonsense words when we get to the memory section. Using kind of Ebbinghaus idea of using nonsense words or nonsense or numbers that really don't mean anything. And we're going to test your short-term memory, because what that suggests is the average person holds about 4 to 7 chunks of information in your short-term memory. Meaning that when we do this task, we'll go over it when we get there, you'll recall about 4 to 6 of 10 to 12 items that I tell you to recall within a very short period of time. And we'll learn that that's very helpful when you go to study. So, for example, if you can remember 4 chunks of information, when you're reading your textbook, you should chunk the information together and read 4 paragraphs, and then go back and recall everything in those 4 paragraphs, and then go on to the next 4 paragraphs. So we'll look at this from a study technique later on. Then Pavlov is often noted as one of the first behaviors, but he actually wasn't. Okay, Pavlov is a famous guy with the ring the bell and the dog salivates, and we'll get more in detail into this more when we get there. But what Pavlov really did is he kind of provided this experimental method that we can use to do what's called associative learning. Associative learning is a type of learning that occurs where the organism does not need to respond to a stimuli in order to learn something, okay? So a good example of this is, I think, the dentist, okay? I don't know about many of you, but every time I hear that drill sound, my mouth kind of is sore. Probably some other better examples is, for some reason, when we walk into our kitchen, we kind of get hungry. When we want to study on the couch, all of a sudden we find ourselves watching the TV instead. When we study on our bed, we find ourselves tired and wanting to go to sleep. These are all associative learning. It didn't take us to be rewarded or punished for anything to learn it, okay? But the interesting thing about Pavlov, just to give you a history about him, is he was actually a Russian scientist, and he was actually interested in the digestion of food. And that's what he originally was studying. That's what he was originally interested in. In fact, it's interesting that he got a Nobel Prize for classical conditioning when he should have probably got a Nobel Prize for things like the invention of antacids, because he was one of the first to study acid in the stomach and how you can stabilize it. But the story is that just really quickly, just to kind of give this preview narrative, is he had, I'm gonna say this, I don't think this would be a humane thing. I don't think we would get this across a IRB board today, but he had these dogs kind of strapped into this thing. And what he wanted to do is measure the amount of saliva as kind of a measure of hunger based on the smell intensity of the food that was presented to them. And so what he did in order to measure this is he surgically inserted in one or two of the saliva capillaries in the dog's mouth a little tube that when the dog started to salivate, it would start to fill up that tube. Okay. And as I think this is probably a little bit more myth than reality, but the myth goes that as Pavlov was sitting there one day and he noticed that one of the dogs started to salivate without the food actually being there. And he was like, well, why is this happening? This shouldn't happen. He's not smelling anything. He's not doing anything. Why is it that the dog is salivating? And after observation, he noticed that the dog started to salivate when their handler started to walk across the floor and started doing the walking steps. And he started to notice by artificially making those walking steps that the dogs would start to salivate. And so this is the idea behind associative learning, is that we're going to see that when there's a stimuli that is normal that elicits an automatic response is paired with a stimuli that is neutral, that shouldn't make that neutral stimuli can then produce the same behavior that the actual stimuli did. I actually call this my fettuccine effect, because in I think it was 2002, 2003, I started a new medication. And the first time I took that medication, I got horribly sick. But the thing is I took that medication and then we, as a family, we went out and had Italian food and I had fettuccine. And the interesting thing about that is even though it was the medication that caused that sickness, I can't even smell fettuccine now. I can't be around it. When I go to Olive Garden, my kids who order it have to put their, still today in 2024, over 20 years later, they have to put their menu so I don't see it because it still makes me nauseous. So that is this kind of learning, is that learning it took me nothing to do, but it was just that association between being sick and a neutral stimulus. But this is going to really ignite John B. Watson, who is known as the father of behaviorism. He wrote the Behaviorist Manifesto because he's going to take Pavlov's idea and he's going to say that this is what we should be studying. This is what we should be doing. And we'll get into one human study with little Albert later on, where he conditioned a fear response in this little infant using the principles of classical conditioning. We'll get into it more then, but it was Watson who took the ideas from Thorndike and Pavlov and really took off with them in an experimental way. But Watson was one of the very few who actually used humans, which is something we'll get to as well. But probably the person who is the poster child for behaviorism is B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner is going to do classical conditioning, but he's going to add the second type of conditioning, which is operant conditioning. Operant is the idea that the organism has to operate on something in order to change behavior. So this is where we're going to get into a pigeon sees a little red light go on, and if he pokes a little, pushes a little button, he'll get a little piece of food, okay? So there's a stimulus, light, response from the organism, pecking on the thing, and then a reward, okay? And with pigeons, that's very easy. I don't know why he chose pigeons, because one thing about pigeons is they actually eat about twice their body mass in food each day. And so they were incredibly expensive to feed and upkeep. I don't know why he chose these, maybe to get more responses out of them, I'm not sure. But, this is how extreme this got, is that individuals like B.F. Skinner, John B. Watson said, bring me your child, tell me what you want them to be, an attorney, a garbage man, a president, and using the laws of operant and classical conditioning, we will make your child into whatever adult you want them to be. And this is how extreme they almost got, is they actually built, you saw back here, these are called Skinner boxes. This is where he would train the pigeons. He then created a human size pigeon box for kids. To put them in there and then train them however the parent wanted them to be trained. Couple fortunate things that happened, and I'm glad they happened, is one, their RIB, their institutional review board, said absolutely not. You're not gonna put some random child in a box until they're 18. And then he's like, okay, I'll use my own children. And Health and Human Services came in and said, no, you're not. You're not gonna do that to your own kids. So while this picture is here, they never actually were able to actually do that, which is an unfortunate thing. The reason I put this is I want to put how extreme the behaviorist movement really felt that they could explain all of human behavior by doing this. Now, just another note on how far behaviorism got is, believe it or not, the first a guided missile or a guided bomb was actually invented by B.F. Skinner. He was one of the first to get a contract to make a precision guided bomb. And what he did in order to do this, because radar and stuff was all new then, is he would train a pigeon to poke on a map to a certain place of where the bomb should go. And then he would put the pigeon in this bomb, and as they went over as the bomb dropped, and the pigeon noticed that place on the map, it would poke towards that map, which would guide the bomb to that target. Now, so this is just interesting, so you know where the first guided bomb came from, but I think it also brings up a very ethical issue. Which is, you're gonna think differently than what I'm probably thinking, I don't know. But I find it interesting, this never took off because they were scared of public perception of blowing up a pigeon. Even though there was no ethical qualms during the war, blowing up thousands of people. So I think it's interesting that here they had this technology that they could have implemented decades before the actual official guided bomb, but they stopped it because they had no ethical qualms of killing people, but they just didn't want that poor pigeon to die. Something to think about on an ethical, moral standing. I don't think either way, if you could avoid killing either one, it would be good, but this sure could have saved a lot of lives from random bombing. Just kind of gonna put that out there. Anyways, and then the last type of learning we're going to learn about is social learning. Social learning is different than imitative learning, and I want to make this point clear. Social learning is when you take a group of behaviors that you observe in the environment and you combine them to make it uniquely yours. Okay, it fits your repertoire of your personality and who you want to be. Okay. the person to originally look at this was Albert Bandura, which we'll talk about quite a bit here, and then when we get to personality section and we talk about self-efficacy and those types of things. But in this, his original studies, you may have heard of this, was the famous Bobo doll studies. For those who are not from the 1900s, a Bobo doll is where you have this weighted base, and then you would blow up this doll, and then when you hit it, it would bounce back up. Okay, and so what Bandura wanted to know is, do we learn things like aggression? Okay. So, and we'll get more detailed into this experiment as we move along, but the basis of it is that some children observed a teacher putting together a Bobo doll very angrily. She hit it with a hammer, she threw it around, she kicked it. And then other children observed a teacher just, blowing it up and putting it up, and no aggression, no anything. And what Bandura was interested in is in the behaviors of the children with it the next day. And what he found is that the children who observed the aggressive teacher were aggressive with the Bobo doll the next day. Those students who did not observe the aggressive teacher were not aggressive with it the next day. Now, there's a lot of caveats to this that we'll discuss. Because it's just not that simple of an experiment, and not that simple of an association. But that's kind of the basis of what he was studying. But when we get to social learning, there's some things that we do need to note, is that there's actually very few species that socially learn. We know that primates do to a certain point, dolphins do, humans do, but most of what we see in species in our world, and unless they're classically or operantly conditioned, which is another topic, but what most other species do is they just develop the programming that is already set in their mind. Okay, so for example, if you had one ant, you picked up one ant and put him somewhere else, the other ants aren't going to follow him. They're going to follow their programmed route based on smell. And so in other species, they do what's called imitative learning. Okay, meaning that they're programmed to learn certain things, and once they learn them, they're set. Okay. And we'll get to this, especially when we get to the Bandura experiments, because if we just did imitative learning, the children the next day should have been just as imitated exactly what the teacher did. But the children didn't. They used different types of aggressions. In fact, we'll see in a film where one of the young boys actually pulled out a toy gun and started shooting the Bobo doll, where the teacher did not do that the day before at all. And we'll see that there were difference in girls as well, that they did different types of aggressive behavior than the teacher. And you'll probably know this, they were more verbally aggressive than the boys were. Okay, and so to say in just this example, imitative learning isn't necessarily what humans do. We do a social learning where we adapt different behaviors to a situation. So there's a couple different rules when it comes to studying human behaviors compared to other species that we know about. And then the person who's going to end the reign of behaviorism is a gentleman named Edward Tolman. Edward Tolman, as we will get to later in the thing, developed something called what's called the cognitive map. Cognitive map is, well, we all have cognitive maps. Like, I know I'll get in my car after work today, And I'll drive home without turning on every side road, thinking that that's gonna take me home. Okay, I have this cognitive map where I have this intuitive notion, if you wanna use the word intuition, of how to get from here to my home. I know how to get from this classroom to my office without going one door or another, or this door or that door, okay? The thing that Tolman discovered though is getting from one place to another doesn't take reward and punishment. It doesn't take associative learning. We can hold a map in our mind for an extended period of time, and I'll just do the basics of it. Basically, what he's gonna do with mice and rats, and I think this would be funny, looking into an experimental room. You have Tolman or his experimental assistant, and he has a little mice or a rat in a little wagon, and he's pulling that wagon around this maze to see, because the idea behind conditioning is you have to operate on it in order to learn, right? Well, if you're pulling the little mouse in a wagon, it's not doing anything. And so the question is then when you let the little mouse go, will the little mouse know where to go in order to get their food? And that's what Tolman found, is that it doesn't take an organism to stop directly operate to get a sense of direction or a sense of place. And therefore, there has to be something in your mind that you're holding information in your mind that then is going to dictate a later action. Okay. And to give you a little fast forward to this, is that indeed we actually have located your cognitive map within your amygdala system in the hippocampal area. And indeed, we do have these areas in our brain that have all of these. If you want to think about it, the maps you have on your phone, you have those in your hippocampus. And when you need them, you draw them up, and we can even say, okay, so when do you want to go home and where are you going to go home? And a certain neuron within your hippocampus will fire, which is kind of cool. I think it's cool that you have a certain map in your head to get you from work to home. It's kind of a cool thing. So we'll learn about that as we move along. Okay. So again, let's see. Okay, I think for today, we're gonna end with a video. Because I have to stop the recording, otherwise people who do the recording will do the whole copyright thing. So I'm gonna stop the recording, but I wanna play a video to kind of give a funny preview of what we're gonna be talking about. So let me stop the recording first. Whoops.